For more resources, visit rym.org.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
Hey everybody, we are back on our Friday show. Dr. Duncan, oftentimes when we have people come on the show, we talk about books and we emphasize the importance of reading. And I think it's fairly safe to say that you're an avid reader. And so outside of the Bible, what books have most influenced you? And then kind of a follow-up to that, what are you currently reading?
It's hard to say and to narrow down to just a few books what has been most significant in my life. And there have been certainly different times of my life when different books have had an impact. I will say that boys sometimes lag behind girls in terms of getting a taste for reading. And it was in my junior year AP English course in high school that the fires just clicked on in my heart for reading. And the book that was used to just sort of turbocharge my desire for reading as a maybe, 17-year-old junior in high school was J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I had a reading assignment where we had to read fiction literature from a list that Mrs. Parks, my AP English teacher, had given us. It was on the list, and I started reading it, and I was hooked. And not only did I come to love Tolkien, but I came to love reading in a way that I had never loved it before. I'd been reading, since I was a little kid, and reading outside of my assignments since I was a little kid. But my thirst for reading really, really changed. And I know part of that was a developmental thing. I was 17 years old. My frontal lobe is developing. There are all sorts of things happening, from the standpoint of just human development that were going on in me. But there was spiritual development going on as well. And so that book and Tolkien's writings have ever since been very, very dear to me. Tim Keller and I have joked over the years that we wonder how much our mutual love of Tolkien's writings has impacted our friendship with one another. So that book, as not necessarily a book of Christian theology, but just of really, really good fiction literature, had a big impact on me. Now, early on in my Christian life, the writings of J.I. Packer, R.C. Sproul, and Sinclair Ferguson had those three men in particular, their popular writings. Packer's Knowing God just had a big impact on me. Sinclair Ferguson's Doctrine of the Christian Life, which I think originally came out as something like Knowing Christianity or something like that. And then R.C. Sproul's popularizing works all had, they helped me start reading theology in digestible bites and getting excited about the truth of God's Word. And so all of those had a big impact on me. Reading Calvin's Institutes in seminary, first with a dear friend of mine who was a seminary classmate. We just started reading through the Institutes in the Old Beveridge translation together. And then I took a course on Calvin's Institutes with David Calhoun. And Dr. Calhoun and the class, there was a small class of maybe 5 or 6 of us. We read through the entire Institutes together over the course of a year. And that was just an amazing experience. I know Kevin DeYoung started reading through Calvin's Institutes when he was in college and has made a habit of just rereading it kind of on a constant basis over time. And the Institutes had that kind of an impact on me, just a a profound effect in terms of the spiritual effect on me, forming my own theological ideas, understanding the importance of Calvin on all of Protestant theology over the last 500 years, understanding the history and background of the Reformation. That had a big impact on me. History and biography also has had a tremendous impact on me. Reading Christian history and reading Christian biographies have been very, very important in my Christian life. So, everything to reading biographies of the reformers. I think maybe the first biography of a reformer that I read was the little popular biography of Martin Luther by Roland Bainton called Here I Stand. And that is a rip-roaring yarn. Martin Luther's life is exciting, but Roland Bainton is a really good storyteller. And that's a biography that every Protestant ought to read. Really, every Catholic ought to read it too. But it's a great retelling of the life of Martin Luther, and there's spiritual lessons for us in encountering that story. So the life of Martin Luther, and then a man named T.H.L. Parker wrote a little 100-page biography of John Calvin that actually I think you can get from Desiring God, the ministry of John Piper. You can get it for free. You can download it in a PDF file. And it is a good little biography of John Calvin and will really give you a feel and a taste for his life. And so, I started reading Reformation era biographies and then all the way up through the 20th and 20th century biography. So J. Gresham Machen's biography by Ned Stonehouse had a big impact on me in a variety of ways. So Christian biography, Christian history, and then, of course, great books of Christian doctrine have had a huge impact on me. When I was in postgraduate school in Scotland, I really began reading the Church Fathers in a concentrated way for the first time in my life, and concentrated especially on the first 3 centuries of the church, before the Council of Nicaea especially. And that was just, it was a riveting experience to just sort of read chronologically through the Church Fathers and get a feel for the challenges and the context and the contributions of the fathers of the church. And so I remember reading the late 2nd, early 3rd century theologian Irenaeus for the first time, and just being overwhelmed by how close he was to the age of the apostles, and how he was discipled by someone who had been discipled by the Apostle John, and reading the sermons of Melito of Sardis and his exposition of the Passover in Exodus 12, and in light of the work of Christ on the cross, and just thinking that this is a man who was a younger contemporary of the apostles, expounding the Old Testament from the standpoint of preaching Christ. So that all of those experiences in reading were enriching to me. Right now, I always keep a lot of things going at once. I'm reading I'm reading Francis Grimke right now, who's a new hero of mine. Your friend and mine, Caleb Cangelosi, has just produced a little volume of Grimke's thoughts about preaching. I think it's just called Meditations on Preaching, that you can get from Log Cabin Press or Log College Press.
That's right.
But I've been reading Grimke's collected works. It's a 4-volume set of his collected works. And Grimke was he was born to a slave and a slave master in Charleston, South Carolina, before the Civil War. When his father died, his father left in his will for Francis Grimke to be freed. But his father's brother enslaved Francis Grimke, and then Francis Grimke escaped and went to the north. And he became a Presbyterian preacher. He studied under Charles Hodge at Princeton and became the pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., which he pastored for almost a half century. And so I've been reading his collected writings and just reveling in this hero of the Presbyterian faith that I had really never heard about until Thabiti Anyabwile wrote a book called Faithful Preachers. And Grimke was one of those preachers. And I said, man, here is one of my spiritual ancestors that I didn't even know about. And so I've been reading Grimke. I'm reading a lot, right now, just on the whole issue of theology and race. Right now, I've actually just picked up a book on the history of racism amongst white fundamentalism in the early part of the 20th century, called Doctrine and Race. So I'm trying to get up to speed on some areas in my own reading where I think there's probably been gaps. I've read a lot of 16th century reformers, and I've read a lot of 17th century reformers, and I've read a lot of 19th and 20th century reformed work, but there's certain gaps. And so I'm always trying to work in filling in gaps in my areas of knowledge that would keep me from being able to minister as effectively as I can to all of my students and to our churches. And so those are some of the things I'm reading right now.
Well, that's great. I mean, those are encouraging, and we're going to try to get the links up to a lot of those so people can check that out if they're listening to this. Just curious, and kind of putting you on the spot, are you in the process of working on a new book? Do you have anything on the back burner that you can share?
Well, I've been of late writing chapters and forewords, frankly, more than anything else. I've got a couple of chapters. The RTS is producing a full volume set on covenant theology, and I'm writing a couple of chapters in that particular work. I've just written a chapter on Matthew Henry. There's a volume celebrating the 300th anniversary of Matthew Henry's death. He died in 1714, and so in 2014 there was a conference, and now there's a book being produced out of that conference that will be published by Erdman's on Matthew Henry, and I've got a chapter on his method for prayer in that particular volume that I've just written. And so I have a lot of little short things that I've been working on. My big project, I've got a book on covenant theology that I owe to Presbyterian and Reformed, in a series that Sean Lucas is editing, and then of course these chapters for the RTS volume. But I have one of my long-term goals is to turn my dissertation into a book on covenant theology in the early church, and so that's my big sort of long-term goal project. And I have a lot of shorter things that I'm working on along the way.
Yeah, well, Dr. Duncan, you've taken a lot of time out with us, and I know you've got a lot on your plate. So once again, thank you so much.
It's great to be with you, John, and the Lord bless you.
Oh, come and buy without money. Oh, come and feast without